Hi everyone, I'm delighted to be sharing this little slideshow with you all, and it's actually fun to be talking about landscape painting because if you're at all familiar with my work, I'm mostly known for painting portraits and figures. Here's an example of some of my typical work. This is a ballerina I did a few years ago, and when I was first starting out as an artist, I never really considered myself to be a landscape painter. In college, my primary focus had been figurative work with a really strong classical bias, and when I got out, so to speak, I was immediately seeking opportunities for commission portraits and for getting some of my other work, such as still lives, into local galleries. So landscape was never really a priority there at the beginning. Here's some of my early stuff. Pretty safe, pretty classical. The black background was kind of a cop-out to keep from doing anything really complicated. And then I began to realize that the landscape, well, it permeates everything. Here are a couple of commission paintings I did back in 2009, and this was only about a year into my career, and I'm a little mortified sharing these with you. The one on the left with the dogs, the trees are clearly just very poorly painted. There's not a whole lot of, you can just tell that I don't have a lot of experience yet at this point. I'm copying my reference photo and not really thinking much about design other than the obvious, maybe not having a tree coming out of the subject's head, but still, they're very distracting, and the boy and the dogs look like cutouts, even though I was working from photo references here. So from the very start, I could tell that trees were going to be an issue for me. The painting on the right, the trees are definitely painted better because they're painted more simple and in groupings, but again, I'm still being very truthful to my reference photo. And there is some atmosphere there, but there could definitely be more. So I find myself jumping between the subjects in the foreground and the background is really competing with the subjects. So these are things that I was discovering early on in my career as I was starting to do more commission portraits, realizing that the landscape would eventually need to be given a bit more of my attention. You can't be an artist and ignore the landscape. At least you can't be a very well-rounded artist. When I think of all the greatest painters who ever lived, such as Sargent, Sorolla, Wyeth, or some of our contemporaries like Jeremy Lipking, Huang Ho, Daniel Sprick, it goes without saying that they spent hours and hours in the field painting the landscape from life. Here I'm showing two different images of Sorolla where he would drag out these massive canvases to the location, even on the beach, on a windy day, it didn't matter. He brought it out there and he was working on the painting directly from life. Now, doing this brings that knowledge of light, atmosphere, seasonal change, subtle color shifts, responsive decision making. They bring that all back to the studio where it then informs everything else they do. And so realizing that I needed to further my education beyond just what I could get out of a studio session or a photo reference, I got my very first Pochade box at the ripe old age of 26, and I took it with me on an epic trip to Europe that summer and just painted as best I could, not having taken a single landscape workshop and not really knowing what I was doing. Switzerland was just my favorite. You can already see me though, with this overwhelming landscape in front of me, making a bit of a compositional no-no in my first mark. If you look closely, I'm putting a diagonal right down into one of the bottom corners, and already that hints at a weak design choice, but that's okay. I was learning and enjoying every minute of it. Here's a painting I did in Rome, painting the most obvious thing in front of me, of course. I remember climbing up to the top of a building to get this vantage point, and I was actually very pleased with my painting because to me it felt very truthful to the subject, and leaving it sort of vignetted at the bottom was my way of dealing with just, you can see the crowds and the traffic in the foreground, so I simplified it that way and left all of that to the imagination. Now there's something to be said for just getting out there and painting. And after that trip to Europe, I realized I'd been bitten by a bug that I was never going to recover from, and I was totally okay with it. In spite of my insecurities and those voices in my head that said, "You are not qualified to be doing this," or "You have no idea what you're doing," landscape painting awakened something in me that was unquenchable. This need for quality time outdoors where I could experience awe and wonder in a way that the studio just couldn't cut it. And I could gather lots of helpful information in the process. So I took my painting gear everywhere I went, to weddings, to the beach, on a baby moon in Canada, where you can see I had a little spectator checking it out. And of course, my backyard, especially during the pandemic. This was a scene I painted. It looks like there was snow on the ground, actually, and it was a moon rising, and then there's the city lights of Denver there in the distance. Here's a few more from my backyard. You've got the city lights there again. Looking off to the south is a view of North Table Mountain, and I would do these cloud studies out there. So gathering a lot of great reference material just from my back deck. And I even used plein air painting to help me with the backgrounds of some of my commissioned portraits, such as this one, which I did back in Texas, where I lived from 2008 to 2015. I was doing a lot of commissioned portraits back then. And often it would be children outdoors. Here these girls have their cowboy boots on. But that setting, that atmosphere, that lake that we were at, it was really important to capture the mood and the feeling and the atmosphere of that place. So I remember after taking reference photos of these girls and also doing a color study of them on location, after they left, I set up my plein air painting box and just went to town on these rock formations and the trees in the background, and it proved to be invaluable for the final studio piece. Now, it's been a slow journey, but one that I just wouldn't trade for the world. I love everything about the learning process, even the stacks and stacks of failed experiments, which I have in my studio. And if you can just learn how to paint what you see, then eventually everything gets better, everything gets easier. Technique, speed, design choices, and the ever-daunting issue of choosing what to paint. I don't know about you, but I still find myself driving around for hours looking for that perfect spot with the perfect light and the perfect scenery, and guess what? It's never going to be perfect. That's why artists exist. But perhaps the most important thing we can teach ourselves is how to simplify our subject, or change it in such a way that it becomes even a better composition than what nature is presenting us. And that is a lesson I'm still learning. It's a lesson we can apply to every aspect of painting, not just our landscapes. Our Denver winters can be pretty long, and I'm usually over it by January or February, so that's when I like to escape to a desert somewhere for a few days. I've really enjoyed exploring the national parks, such as Death Valley, Joshua Tree, Big Bend, Zion, Canyonlands, and Arches, just to name a few. This painting is actually from Canyonlands, and this was towards the sunset, so you can see the light sort of disappearing there down in the canyon. And wow, what a spectacular vantage point that was. And one of the things I love about painting the desert is that it is a little bit more challenging to find inspiring subjects. I mean, cliffs and canyons are great, but sometimes you've just got desert and more desert. And so that's why you have to depend on shapes, either the actual shapes of things or the shapes that are created by the light to come up with an interesting design. So in this one, for example, the cast shadows from the cliffs are really the star of the show. But you can use that same idea for just about anything. Ocean paintings. Here's one that I did this summer in Oregon, where again, the cast shadows are really what make for the whole design. Of course, sometimes we can't help but gravitate towards painting the most obvious thing. Here, it's a 3-mile hike to Delicate Arch in Arches National Park, so I would feel wrong to paint something other than the arch itself. I mean, it is truly a magnificent sight, and I've had the pleasure of painting it twice, once in the morning light, which you see on the left there, and once in the late afternoon. And if you paint the same subject often enough, you can start getting really creative with your composition, or the time of day you choose to depict it, or the season. Of course, Monet is famous for doing that with his haystacks, and at that point it's no longer just about the subject, it's about everything else, the light, the color, the atmosphere, and just how we are bringing our own sense of aesthetics to the painting. I've noticed that I tend to gravitate towards particular compositions and design sensibilities. And when I was putting together this slideshow, this was kind of fun. I saw these two paintings and realized that they are very, very similar. They are painted at different locations, but there's a lot in common here, including the diagonals of the water, the rock shapes, and even that yellow foliage in the background. Nothing wrong with that. It was just an observation. And then there's the possibilities that abound when you paint a still life or a floral outdoors. These two, the one on the left was painted outside and the one on the right indoors under artificial light, so big difference. So when I moved to Colorado in 2015, it was one of my big goals, and it still is, it's ongoing, to start painting the figure in the landscape. So sometimes I would hire models and set them up for a quick color study, and then other times the models just presented themselves. This guy was at the top of a hike that I did to a waterfall, and he was just sitting there playing his guitar, so I set up to paint him. Of course, this one also presented a challenge in that I had forgotten to bring my palette, so I had to mix the colors directly on my canvas. Oops. Very often, my children are the subjects of my paintings, so you can see in the little study on the right how the blue of the ocean was reflecting into the back of my son's head. I really doubt a photo would have picked up on that subtle color nuance. This is one of my sister. She modeled for me this past spring in Cabo, and it was both a figure study and a wave study, so extra challenging. But notice again, there's all that blue bouncing into her skin, this time from the sky, and you wouldn't be able to see that kind of color in just a reference photo unless you knew to look for it, and then maybe you could exaggerate it in Photoshop, but those kinds of details often get lost in photos. Here's one of my daughter that I did while she was trying to fish for minnows in a little stream. You can see I shortened the log and made some other compositional decisions in the process. And it was a miracle that she sat so still, but she was really trying to catch those fish. Now, I often use my back deck as a place to set up and do cloud studies, and many of these were helpful in informing some of my studio pieces, such as this one. I actually repainted the cloud shapes quite a few times, because I wanted them to be dramatic but plausible. So this was a combination of using what I've learned from those studies done from life and also just allowing my imagination to play a role as well. On the left, here's a plein air painting from Hawaii, and then on the right, a studio piece I did shortly afterwards. You know, waves, always a work in progress, something I tackle when I'm in the mood for a really tough challenge. The plein air sketch was really helpful in identifying the colors I might use to capture that translucency inside the incoming wave. Here's another example of an on-location study and a studio piece. And this one has more to do, not so much with the waves themselves, but with the angle of kind of looking down on the waves and just how those shapes change depending on your vantage point. And then here we have a couple of studies from overcast or stormy days. The vertical brushwork on the one from Hawaii was, I remember, a bit of a revelation for me because I realized I could change up the direction of my brush strokes in order to capture that feeling of rain in the distance. And these paintings helped inform this figurative piece, which I went on, of course, to embellish, bringing those reds from his skin into the clouds behind him. So dramatizing it just a little. Here's another plein air piece on the left and a studio piece on the right. Of course, very different locations and settings. But I noted with the plein air piece, I was studying the edges of the snow and how the snow was kind of melting down. And then, of course, those little spiky branches sticking out of the snow. And that was helpful for the studio piece. This is the same tree, but two different situations. One was a pretty heavy snowfall, and then the other, the snow was beginning to fall, and that was when I set up for the self-portrait. But it was a great study in snow-laden branches and just the nature and the shapes of those branches themselves. So again, the study doesn't have to be anything special, but it can really inform your studio work. Here's another example of ways that an on-location piece might help me with a painting that I'm doing in my studio. The plein air piece really helped me figure out the colors for making those leaves feel like they were going back in space or forward in space. And they become more rich and earthy further away, and then much brighter and chromatic the closer they are to you. Then here's another figurative piece I did in the studio. I did set up the model outdoors and we did some photos, but this one involved a lot of designing with the trees especially. In the reference photos, it was very thickly, heavily wooded in the background, and so I definitely designed the background a lot more for the final painting. And I love painting fall colors, so I do quite a few paintings on location every year, especially at the end of September or early October, like we're like we're doing here. And so I have a lot of studies that have helped me create paintings like this one, King of the Wild Things. Now, incidentally, it was that little 4x8 study that I'm holding on the left that gave me the idea for the animals in the Wild Things painting. But instead of a rotting log coming towards you in space, it's a wolf and a bear and a deer. And I used multiple references of images of animals taken on wildlife cameras to capture that feeling of them really approaching you, like they're coming in for their close-up. And speaking of close-ups, I'll close with this. Now, sometimes when you're out on location, you get to experience the most magical things that are destined to become core memories, not just because you've painted them, but because when you're painting, you're being truly present in the moment. And a few years ago, I took my daughter with me on one of the most popular hikes in Rocky Mountain National Park to a lake called Dream Lake. When we got to the top, we set up to paint, and it was a rather hot day. And I was concentrating on my painting, looking up and over at the mountains and the lake, when suddenly these elk walked right past me, making a beeline for that cold water, and they just kept coming, like a dozen of them. And I couldn't do anything except sit there and watch with my mouth agape, just in total awe, while they just did their thing. And it was one of the most magical experiences I've ever had on location. There were lots of people there. Everybody was just very respectful of these beautiful animals, and we just got to watch them take their cool bath. I even did this little study of one of them. I don't even know if I have that anymore, but the study, between that and the painting of the mountains I did, I was able to compile a studio piece with the elk in there as well. And I'm just so glad that it all came together. Sometimes you see a scene like this and it's like, no, there's no way that actually happened. But you know, I've got the photos to prove it. So that was pretty awesome. So all that to say, plein air painting has truly enriched every other aspect of my art. It's such a joy to go get out there and do it. Sometimes it can be frustrating, it can be infuriating, but it is well worth the effort. And I applaud you all for giving it your best shot, and I encourage you to just keep going with it because the reward is well worth the investment.